Climate change and food security are two of the biggest problems facing civilization today, and the two are becoming inextricably linked as the changing climate starts to impact agriculture. The world's population is growing rapidly, and experts have suggested that we need to increase crop production by 50% by 2050 if we want to be able to meet rising demands. Climate change is caused by greenhouse gases released from human activities like burning fossil fuels. Scientists agree that it is happening and is caused by us, but are less clear on what the exact effects will be. One thing we do know is that different parts of the world will be affected very differently. In terms of crop production, in some places temperature increases could reduce the damage to crops from harsh winters. In other places, extreme temperatures, droughts and erratic weather could have serious negative impacts. Although governments are working to reduce emissions, the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere will stay there for thousands of years. So, even if we cut all emissions to zero right now, it would not halt climate change. Therefore, we need to find a way to adapt agriculture to the future climate before these predictions become a reality.
Certainly there will be an impact in marginal areas where at the moment we can't grow crops particularly effectively, and so maybe some parts of Africa, perhaps some parts of South America also, maybe some parts of the United States. I think in Northern Europe and Britain the impact's going to be quite minimal because gradually the climate will get warmer here that will actually make it beneficial for growing crops.
But really, overall, the big unknown is what's going to happen, and we really have to prepare for all eventualities.
We need to increase crop production by 50% by 2050, and when you factor in the decreased productivity caused by climate change, this becomes an even more daunting task. The main barrier to food security is distribution, not supply. 2.1 billion people worldwide are obese, yet 805 million still don't have enough food. In the developing world, 81% of wheat consumed there is also produced there, and these are the regions predicted to be more affected by climate change. For example, India is one of the world's most densely populated countries and is the second biggest wheat producer. And if its ideal crop-growing regions are made less hospitable by climate change, the losses could be huge.
In fact, at the moment, global agriculture can feed the world's population. It's more a case of where it's being grown. Will we have to redistribute that crops around the globe? But the problem is, you then got to factor in the cost and the carbon of moving that food around. So it's not just a case of food distribution. It's actually what crops we're growing in that area is the important thing.
Scientists say that if changes are not made, then populations who are already food insecure will suffer. What then are our options?
So there's no, as far as the best option for adapting for climate change, there's no magic bullet, there's no one answer in my opinion. But what we've got to do is use as many different options as we can, and different options will be best in different areas and different scenarios.
Some suggested solutions include changes to farming methods to increase the productivity of existing crops, including increasing genetic diversity by growing lots of different varieties in one field.
One of the things we do know relatively consistently across environments, across different ecosystems, is that if you increase biodiversity, either species diversity or genetic diversity, you tend to get an increase in resilience of that system. And that means that system will be able to bounce back from catastrophic climate events or difficult environmental events. Whether you'll get greater production out of them is another matter.
It's a thing that always has to be traded off, so that you want diversity so there's a resilience to your crops, so that if a single disease or a single weather event comes, it doesn't wipe everything out. So that's important, but at the same time that some of those diverse crops may not have the higher yields that you need for production purposes. So again, it's a case of needing some balance.
We will eventually need new stress-resistant crop varieties, and these can either come from conventional breeding, which can be slow, or from the ever-controversial GM technology. Some campaigners such as Greenpeace say that GM has too many issues and it's not safe and that we don't need it, and they're campaigning to have it completely banned. However, other people say that we should be using everything in our toolbox to combat climate change.
So I think actually 95% of it's going to be regular crop breeding. I think GM will have a part to play, but I think it's perhaps going to be quite a limited part.
But we must remember that in some areas climate change will benefit crop production. It's not all a negative story. Some areas they will benefit from the warming, slightly warmer temperatures, higher CO2, which would be great for some plants in some crops in some areas. So it's all not going to be negative. But obviously some areas will need some help to develop new crops, and we can use non-genetic methods to help us with that. But we also need what we call transgenic procedures as well.
Yeah, so the problem at the moment with GM technology is you can really only clone one or maybe two genes at once, and so there's a very limited number of traits which you can transfer because most traits are coded by a large number of genes.
We can make it faster, easier and safer. And in the end, because any product that's produced by GM is going to have to go through some kind of rigorous safety testing, just like we have for drugs, the actual products you produce in the end are potentially safer than the ones that you would have produced through conventional breeding.
The question is, despite the issues and limitations associated with it, would it be naive to completely ban GM and therefore halt any further research into it? Could this possibly restrict the ability of future generations to adapt to climate change?
GM technology is not new. We must remember more than 60 million farmers worldwide are already using GM crops. 90% of them are resource-poor farmers in areas where the GM crops are making the big difference. We mustn't forget that it's already there, it's already out there. It's just in Europe we have this reticent to embrace this technology.
I mean, the experiment is being done. How long are we going to have to sit here ignoring the results, which is slowing down our research because we're restricted in what we can do in the lab because of the regulations about GM.
So for the last, at least a decade, in Europe there's been effectively through regulation a ban on the growing of GM crops within European countries, and while that doesn't necessarily have a negative impact for European countries, it has impacts on other countries around the world that are interested in exporting crops into Europe. And so it creates great uncertainty for them about what they should grow, whether they can adopt new techniques or not. So it's all interconnected in that way.
I don't think there should be a ban on GM because I don't think there should be a ban on any type of science which might be beneficial. GM will certainly have an improvement on crop production. It might not be huge, but that isn't a reason to say we shouldn't do it. I think it's more a question of everybody working together cooperatively to understand the problems with GM, if there are problems, what those might be, as opposed to sort of having two sides who are just sort of shouting at each other.
If it takes 20 years to solve a problem rather than 5 years, how many people are going to die of starvation before you've solved it? And that's really what it comes down to.
Of course, this is a mainly scientific point of view, whereas many of the issues surrounding GM are social and political or relate to the biotech companies producing the crops.
So I think one of the things that we actually do need to do is we need to have better governance and better regulation of things like GM, because there are ethical issues surrounding GM that we're not really addressing at the moment.
It's a bit like saying, well, drug companies are evil, and we know drug companies are not particularly nice. Therefore, we're not going to take medicine when we get ill. And that's what we're doing with GM. We're saying this is a medicine for food productivity. It's a medicine for farming. But we're saying because we don't like the companies that produce the medicine, then we're not going to use the products that they produce. And I think, well, we're not taking that attitude with drugs, so why are we taking it with GM plants?
In order to prevent climate change from having catastrophic consequences for food security, we're going to need to use every option available to us. Although GM may just be a small part of the picture, surely it's better to address and overcome the issues associated with it rather than reject the technology, so that if future generations do need to use it, it's ready to use.